Yeah, my name is Nabil Quadri. I lead product management for VMware's disaster recovery as a service solutions. That includes, of course, VMware Cloud DR, which is what we're talking about today, as well as VMware Site Recovery, our SRM-based service that we've had in the market for some time now. Been at VMware for about 7 years now, and based out of the California Bay Area, although it's not super relevant at this moment in time. All right, so I'm going to be talking about focusing on the SaaS Orchestrator component and kind of covering a little bit of the bits and pieces that connect all that we've talked about in the previous sessions, right? How do those components fit together? Why do we think this is reliable? Why do we think this is good for the ransomware recovery use case? And I think there were some questions about the cost implications to customers, so we can sort of cover that as well, and then get into more of an open Q&A after. So with that, let me the next slide. So we talked about previously in previous sessions about what you want from a good DR solution, right? So we kind of structured the narrative around these four simple to understand concepts: low total cost, fast recovery, ease of use, and high reliability, right? So you want the low cost, and if you want more details on that, please view the session that Suzala did, focusing on the cloud file system, on how the solution delivers the low total cost. But fast recovery is super important as well when you're talking about DR, because downtime is expensive, right? And the quicker you can recover from an outage, the more manageable and the adverse impact to your business. The ease of use, super important, often gets overlooked when organizations are evaluating their DR options. And the reason for this is because when you're in that sort of outage or disaster situation, it isn't guaranteed that you'll have your expert, your DR expert or your DR admin available to execute all of this, right? So that's simplicity of the ability to execute DR plans and monitor the progress and make sure it proceeds to completion is super, super important. And lastly, the high reliability aspect, right? And we touched a little bit upon that in the cloud file system session earlier about the data integrity checks and so on. And that's a very important aspect for us to think about as well.
Nabil, you touched on the importance of simplicity. What about documentation? Is VMware Disaster Recovery doing anything to help document example like expected RTO versus actual like RTA? For instances when the backup guy isn't there and someone else has to step in.
Yeah. So we have fairly detailed reports that can be pulled up, and I think we have one more demo session coming up where I believe this is going to be covered. But yeah, we have fairly detailed reports that kind of show as a summary view of how long your plan took to execute, which basically shows your actual recovery time in a disaster scenario, and it also shows a very detailed log of how much time each of those recovery steps took. You can also monitor for things like compliance, which is, again, something that we'll cover in a subsequent demo session, but I'll also cover here conceptually. So we have these continuous compliance checks that happen every 30 minutes that kind of show the health of not only both your DR side, but also the veracity and the health of your DR plans themselves in terms of being complete in the sense of the inventory mappings being complete and all of the state being essentially stable and complete, right? So that when you have that guarantee that when you click that button to fail over, the plan has a high likelihood of succeeding. And you can extract reports of those compliance checks as well. They're nicely formatted PDFs, and we kind of we'll go into that a little bit in the demo, I think. The service itself is well documented, as our many other VMware products, and it's available publicly at a URL that we can share later. And in addition to that, right, when we talk about documentation, for the service itself. I believe at Atrium, right, had actually guides on the best practices to address ransomware recovery, for example, right? What's the right kind of steps that you follow for that? So both in terms of service documentation as well as documentation specific to your environment and specific to your DR setup, we're well covered there.
And you'll show those later on in a demo, the documentation?
Mike, is that coming up in the demo session that you're doing? Or did you already cover that? I think maybe we might have skimmed past it.
We'll be covering that in a lot more detail in the next session.
Awesome.
Great.
Okay. Any other questions? All right, I'm gonna keep moving here. So let's talk about the recovery time aspect, right? First of all, so why is all of the DR orchestration stuff that this product does important? And the reason is kind of illustrated by this slide here, which shows, for workloads that you're trying to protect and potentially fail over in a disaster scenario, right? And they're connected to different networks, they have different IPs, they're in different folders, different clusters. And when you don't have this sort of orchestration built in to the service, to the solution out of box, then what that adds is a lot of additional time to your recovery process to perform that placement of those workloads, right? And it's fine to recover a handful of VMs to do that manually, but when you're talking about massive scale of maybe dozens or hundreds or even thousands of VMs, that's when this becomes really a challenge, right? And really adds to your risk and the cost of your downtime. So that's one aspect to keep in mind. Secondly, what adds to both the recovery time as well as the complexity and the operational challenge of managing the disaster recovery process is the change in the operational model, right? As you fail over to an operating environment that could be that is very different, right? And this is a challenge we see with other cloud-based backup or DR solutions that might be failing over to more of a native cloud environment that is not vSphere based, right? And so what that results in is you're going from managing your infrastructure in the familiar vCenter, vSphere client type of interface with the vSphere specific abstractions for networking and the tools that are associated with that, the runbooks that you have that are specific to your organization that are kind of tied to how the vSphere environment works. Then you're going from that to an environment that is very different, right? Uses different abstractions for networking, different tools, different consoles, and different operational runbooks. And for someone who is setting this up and testing these DR plans on a regular basis, which is typically would be your DR admin or DR team, it's all fine and good, right? They can get trained up on that new environment and kind of be familiar enough with it to kind of make sure the test goes well. But again, when you're in that disaster situation, you may not have those people on hand to actually shepherd that process of recovery and getting back to a normal state of operations. And that's where these sort of operational inconsistencies do matter, right? And tied to that sort of is the fact that solutions that fail over to native cloud do require format conversions, right? Which again introduces compatibilities both on the failover, but also potentially on the fail back, because that's another conversion that needs to happen and often comes with caveats, right? When you read the fine print. And then sort of just a quick word on the slowness and complexity of recovery, making DR testing challenging, right? So all of the things that I talked about in the last few minutes about recovery being slow or the operational inconsistencies that are introduced by failing over to a non-vSphere environment, those kind of disincentivize, if you will, frequent DR testing, right? And what happens with infrequent DR testing is the fact that the outcome of that is that your recovery risk increases, right? Because your configuration drifts, you add new workloads to your production environment. And while you might try to stay kind of in sync with that and make sure that your DR configuration, your DR solution is configured to keep up, you can only do so much, right? And so there's always that little bit of risk that keeps increasing the longer the gap between your DR test events. And so how does VMware Cloud DR address these issues, right? Firstly, it is failing over to a VMware Cloud on AWS environment, which is vSphere based, as we've seen in some of the previous demo sessions. The operating environment, right, that you're failing over into is pretty much, it's a vCenter server, right? And it's managed by vSphere client, the same UI that you're used to as a vSphere administrator. It uses the same networking constructs, the same tools. You can have your same runbooks. And very importantly, there's no workload format conversion, right? The VM images is being converted to a different format. It stays as a combination of a vSphere VM with VMDKs attached. So that's one aspect. The second aspect, I think, which hopefully we've communicated through the previous demos and all that we've talked about so far, but just to kind of bring it home, very simple SaaS experience, right? It's a cloud-based UI, cloud-based interface that's running accessible via the VMware Cloud Services platform, which can be federated with your own organization's identity management system for additional level of security. But it is running in the cloud. You are able to protect multiple sites to it. So there's fan in, there's a global summary view, and just overall, it's been built from the ground up to provide that extreme simplicity of use. You'll see that it's sparse in terms of the number of menu options that exist, and on each screen has a lot of white space and stuff. So that's, we think, very important. But also importantly, right, SaaS is not just about the UI and where the portal is running. It's also about what it takes to deploy and connect and maintain the solution, right? And that's where the fact that this offers zero-touch day two operations really comes into play. So the initial deployment is pretty much, just deploying an OVF for the DRaaS connector on your on-prem environment and registering it as a protected site with your VMware Cloud DR portal or UI. But even in terms of day two operations, it's all automated, right? Not only are the cloud components upgraded and maintained and automatically as part of our regular sort of upgrade cycle, they are also self-healing, so that if a component goes down, it brings itself back up. And because they're largely stateless, this is something we'll go into in a little bit, the recovery time is very fast. And very importantly, that on-prem connector that you deploy in your protected or production site also updates itself automatically via over-the-air upgrades coming from the cloud service.
I have a question in regards to the portal. Everything we've seen so far has been UI driven, but I know in some cases you do want an interface that is either API or command line driven. Is that experience available for VMware Cloud DR?
Not today. We've again, going back to that theme of focus and delighting customer delight, we've focused on the UI experience first. The solution itself is built largely on a REST API framework. So internal communication is via REST APIs. It's all very designed, given modern architectural principles for a cloud-first architecture, right? It's designed from the ground up to run in the cloud. However, we don't yet expose those APIs to customers to use. That is something that we are exploring as part of our technology outlook.
Okay. Yeah, I'm thinking of situations where I might want to integrate this with other systems that I have, like my ticketing system or my chat ops system or something like that. I'd really like to be able to snap into that API to get information or trigger different actions.
Yeah, fair enough. And one other sort of scenario in which customers tend to want that ability to automate is to integrate, sort of offer a self-service experience around DR protection. That is something that actually can be done through the UI today through our role-based access control mechanisms. And we're going to, again, get into that a little bit. There is a separate sort of role that can only be used for DR protection, right? For example. Yes, it's not the single pane of glass, and for that you would need some sort of integration mechanism, but we have sort of a partial answer for that today.
Okay.
So again, this is something that was covered very well in a previous demo session, but just to kind of summarize what the orchestrator is capable of here. The SaaS Orchestrator component, which is kind of the other major component other than the scale-out cloud file system, is running in the cloud. It is the component that where the UI portal resides and where our internal API endpoints are as well. And it offers this sort of wide spectrum of capabilities that you should be familiar with if you're familiar with SRM, which is our other sort of premium enterprise grade DR orchestrator offering. So very similar set of operations with a few key differences and what we think are enhancements really to the user experience, right? So in terms of workflows, it supports a non-disruptive test workflow that allows you to bring up the VMs off of the live mount with a very small, very short recovery time, perform your end user testing, application level testing, and then at the click of another button, spin it all down. And being able to do all of this while the replication continues, right, to your cloud target, so that if there's an outage during the DR test, you're still protected and you're still able to recover very quickly from that. The DR test supported the recovery workflow, of course, the reason why we're doing all of this, right, that is supported out of the box, and we're going to talk about what capabilities that entails. And then there's a Delta-based failback workflow that is again out of the box. Doesn't come with caveats and is quite efficient in terms of how that data is transferred, and also allows you to sequence things as you would in your DR plan normally, right, for the forward direction. It supports environment mappings because your production site, the inventory there and how VMs are placed in how the clusters are segregated and how the folders are organized. And how your network configuration looks like might be different in your production site than in your DR site, which is running in VMware Cloud on AWS. And so the orchestrator offers you out of the box the capability to map all of these entities from the production site to the DR site ahead of time, so that when you're actually executing that workflow, it all kind of does the placement automatically, right? And this is what saves you on that recovery time, what allows sort of anyone, even someone who's not super familiar with your DR plans, to be able to execute it in terms of an outage. Recovery steps, we talked about that as well. And when you're recovering VMs at large scale, you don't want to recover everything in parallel because that can cause resource conflicts. You also don't want to sequence everything one by one. So you want a more sophisticated tiering mechanism, if you will, where you say, these set of VMs should come up first because they're my most important or foundational workloads. These set of VMs should come afterwards, and so on, right? And we actually support an arbitrary number of tiers, right? So it's not limited to 3 or 5 or how many ever. And this is kind of one difference with SRM, for example. We do allow for pauses through the recovery steps so that you can actually have the plan pause. And that could be a trigger for you, a prompt for you to go and do, check something or do something that's outside of the scope of what VMware Cloud DR is doing for you as part of your failover process. You can pause for user input, so that. Sorry, I flipped the two. So you pause for user input. You can also pause for fixed duration of time, where you want the plan to automatically proceed after that duration expires. And we allow you, as part of the recovery plan, to execute custom in-guest scripts, both pre and post failover, right? And there's some advanced capabilities as well, right? So first of all, you're able to, from within the VMware Cloud DR UI, able to spin up that SDDC, add hosts, add clusters, add networks to it, configure the firewall rules. But to be noted, you are also able to do that directly via the VMware Cloud Console, if you prefer, right? And that does give you a greater variety of options as to what you can configure on that SDDC. Right? For example, you might want to connect to a direct connect on that SDDC, or you might want to configure HCX on that SDDC, or you might want to disable some cores and some hosts, right, for licensing purposes. So those sort of advanced capabilities that sort of go to the normal setup of an SDDC are things that you can do through the VMware Cloud Console once you've spun up the SDDC via the VMware Cloud DR UI, right? So kind of best of both worlds, right? Easy, one-click spin up of the SDDC, and then you can either customize it to a certain extent within the VMware Cloud DR UI, or you can go to the VMware Cloud Console for full management of that SDDC that you now have in your steady state. We offer IP address mapping, customization. We talked about the reports, and we're going to go into that in a lot more detail in a subsequent demo session. And a very nice thing about this is also that you can configure automatic email alerts on various events, like your plan completing or your plan reading a certain step, and for compliance checks and so on.
In terms of some of the custom ingest scripts, since you're already aware of some of the common tasks that someone might be trying to perform, do you have a marketplace or a repository of common scripts that might be used during the automated recovery?
Not right now that I'm aware of, but that's a great idea. We should probably do that.
All right, go for it.
All right, in the interest of time, I'm going to skip through this slide and sort of emphasize on one quick aspect and kind of end with the architectural picture. So I mentioned the compliance checks and what the increasing risk over time of not doing frequent DR testing, right? So this is kind of, if you look at the first chart on the left here, you'll see that that's the sort of increasing recovery risk over time if you're doing infrequent testing. When you do frequent DR testing, which, if the solution that allows you to do that quickly and reliably and with minimal complexity, and you're able to do that, the risk goes significantly down because the drift over between two consecutive tests is smaller, right? But then in addition to that, what VMware Cloud DR also offers is these compliance checks or health checks every 30 minutes that go through the entire list of mappings and recovery steps that you've configured in each of your DR plans and checks it for validity and checks it for holes and gaps with respect to both your production site and your DR site if it's spun up. And so that we think is a really good thing because it reduces the number of surprises that you might get even in your DR tests, right? And secondly, we talked a lot about data integrity in the previous session, the file system session, but just to kind of summarize, the file system is built from the ground up with an integrity-first design. The snapshots themselves are immutable. They're encrypted at rest and then motion, and then daily data integrity checks are part of the solution as well. So we take data integrity very, very seriously. And this goes to the fact that, we think that a fourth and key pillar of a good DR solution is offering that high reliability, both in terms of your DR plan configuration, but also in terms of the veracity and integrity of your backups. There's a lot of questions previously about the architecture and how the components fit together. So I just want to kind of bring it all together and show that in a single architectural diagram. So we talked about how the cloud components are running in the cloud, and that includes the scale-out cloud file system, which is the abstraction layer and the magic essentially that happens on sitting on top of the cloud object storage, right? Which is S3 in the case of AWS. And there's also the SaaS Orchestrator, which is what we talked about in this session in some detail. And all of these components are actually contained and reside within a VMware managed AWS account and AWS VPC that is dedicated to each and every tenant, right? So it's not shared. It's fully isolated from that perspective, and many of our customers really like this aspect, right? That the data they have is not mixing in with data from other customers, and as well as even the control plane and the plans that they have are sort of isolated and protected and secured. Now we talk about how the connection to your protected site, your on-prem site, is via this connector appliance VM. And the channel, the communication channel between the connector and the components in the cloud is a secure network, proprietary network protocol, and forever incremental replication happens over those over that link. And in terms of network firewall rule configuration, you only need outbound access on 3 network ports from that VM out to the specific cloud components.
Nabil, can I jump in?
Yeah, sure.
And first of all, I apologize for my question I'm about to ask, but I've been doing disaster recovery for about 25 years. And what I'm seeing you guys present right now is really hard for me to put in my book, write down saying this is a disaster recovery tool. Because what I'm not seeing are the things that are critical to disaster recovery. What I'm seeing is that this is a really good tool set for data center migration. That's what I'm seeing. But you're talking about disaster recovery being a server being migrated to the cloud, but many clients that I've talked to, a disaster is not necessarily a server going down, a data center going down. It's caused by a business interruption. And when they determine that interruption has elapsed 2 hours, an hour, 4 hours, then they declare disaster, and then they have to go in and execute their DR plan, whatever that is. So help me understand from a DR guy perspective how this is going to lay into that pattern, if you will.
Okay, so let me kind of maybe
Thank you.
take that. So the first step is to do DR, you have to kind of have a second copy of your data somewhere else. And either you can have a second physical data center. In our case, we are saying, hey, we will take these backups and put it in the cloud. So in that respect, that is one of the kind of must-have things is offsite data, and we have that. The second thing is that when you have a disaster, things go down. How quickly can I bring up my workloads with a runbook orchestration, which is also what we do. We provide this runbook orchestration. The difference between on-prem and us is that you don't have to buy any hardware or anything like that. You just have to click a button. We will do all the runbook automation. And we bring up your workloads and power them on in the right order and deploy the SDDC on demand when you need it, and then run the workloads. So in that sense, if your data center is down, we are able to, rather than doing it in a physical data center yourself, we are able to do this in the cloud and run your workloads in the cloud when there is a disaster.
Okay.
And ultimately, failback is also important, right? I mean, as you know, so when you're done with it, you push a button, we'll bring all your workloads back in the most optimal way back to your data center. So that's no different than a physical data center, except we're trying to make it simpler and more cost effective and less training required to make it work.
So what you're talking about is data center disaster recovery.
Yes.
No, it doesn't need to be, though.
Yeah, it doesn't need to be, by the way. So you don't have to have.
Though he just got done saying that. That's what I'm.
Yeah. So it doesn't have to be, because you can make lots of DR plans. Like you can make a few VMs. You don't have to fail the entire data center or failover. If you have like maybe out of your 1,000 VMs, only 20 have a problem. You want to bring up somewhere else? Sure, absolutely. You can click on those 20 and you can say, I want to bring up here right now. Yes, you can do that. Yeah, but we're making it easy.
And the key here also, like that kind of distinguishes it from migration solutions disguised, as DR solutions, is the failback, right? We offer true failback. We're not trying to lock you into that DR side, right? That's the whole idea here, is that to offer a full-featured failback that comes without caveats, allows you to fail back that subset of VMs that you fail over. And it could be truly a subset while your production data center is actually fully up, right? It's just that particular subset of applications that's been affected. So we allow you to fail that back without caveats and, with minimum disruption, right? And we think that also hopefully it makes us better and differentiated from solutions that don't offer that. Right?
I think you guys would serve yourselves well, to Ned's point, if you would open up your APIs to some of your partners, because I'm sorry, I'm going to be real honest here. I think you're missing the mark with what disaster recovery really is. You both just described to me again what you've been saying in the last several slides, that this is a data center disaster recovery solution set. If you had API integration with some of your partners, because that's important, because those partners that are doing data protection, that are doing file level, that are doing database level, those customers they declare disaster when their database goes to bed and doesn't wake up. But what you're saying is, well, I can fail over that server with that failed database to another cloud data center. You're not going anywhere inside of that server to fix that database. And that's what I'm saying. If that's where disaster recovery really is disaster recovery. It's not just the server.
So there is the backup restore,
but it's also the database and the file level.
Got it. So there is the operational recovery and there's disaster recovery. It is true we are focusing on a little bit more on the disaster recovery than the operational recovery, in the sense that if you want to recover a single VM, you can recover a single VM from our interface. You can bring back some older copy back to your data center and go fix it. Yes, we don't have sophisticated tools to dig into the Oracle database and maybe dig in the table and bring that back. That's operational recovery. So look, there is a lot of sophisticated customers out there. We are aiming for a simplicity in kind of having a disaster recovery, and it's not doing all the job of what operational recovery does, but it's focused particularly on a topic, which is if you have a data center failover or maybe a rack failure, you can bring up all the workloads in the cloud quickly and without having to maintain a second data center yourself.
And we don't see our solution being fundamentally incompatible with what the state that you're describing, right? In fact, if you watch some of the Datrium has been presented at TechField Day before, and you might have seen that the Datrium solution actually had file level recovery supported with the primary storage option that they offered, right? And that is something that we would look to carry over to this, right? So file level recovery, sure, yeah. I mean, it's all very efficiently stored, right? And that's not a hard problem. We've solved the hard problem of storing the data efficiently and making it instantly accessible from within this cloud file system, right? And to take that to the level where we can offer deeper sort of recovery at the file level and so on is something that we would look to do over time.
Great.
So it's not incompatible with what you're doing here. It's
Thanks.
Maybe another level.
Sure.
All right, I think I'm over time, so let me wrap up here. We talked about the appliance. It is using VADP today to perform the replications and the data extraction. And we talked about the orchestrator, the connection between the VMware Cloud environment and the VMware Cloud DR environment is via the what's called the cross-account elastic network interface feature that AWS offers in limited respect to select partners. And that's what we are leveraging here for high bandwidth, high throughput connectivity between the two tenants. It's presented as an NFS data store, as we've talked about before. And the user access mechanism is unified under the VMware Cloud Services platform, and which means that you have a single identity management layer that you can leverage, which can be federated with your own corporate domain, as I mentioned earlier. And just in terms of the cost implications of all of this, because that came up, as Mark covered before, you're paying for the service on a per terabyte or per tebibyte and per VM capacity, and that includes the cost of all of this infrastructure that we're running. Right, this picture is just to kind of show you what's running under the covers. But from a packaging perspective, it's all included. Of course, you have to pay for the host that you spin up separately as part of the VMC host, but everything in this purple box and related to that purple box is covered by our pricing, right? So egress costs, data transfers, S3 requests, all of the components that we're running, the persistence mechanisms that we might have internally, all of that is covered by the pricing. So that was a hopefully very quick run through. I just wanted to maybe leave this slide up here that shows kind of our role-based, sorry, not this one, our role-based access control mechanism. So we do have those granular controls over who can do what in the VMware Cloud DR portal. We have a DR admin that can only configure DR plans, a backup admin that can do protection group configuration, SDDC admin that can spin up those SDDCs and modify them, a role that can only do DR tests but not failovers, and then auditor roles as well.